welcome. On behalf of Heriot-Watt University, the Universities of Glasgow, Stirling, Dundee and St Andrews, and the Chartered Institute of Housing, welcome to Scotland and to Edinburgh for the 26th Conference of the European Network for Housing Research. We are delighted that so many people have chosen to come to Edinburgh to attend and to participate in our conference. It is 20 years since the ENHR conference was last held in Scotland. How much the world has changed since then. In 1994, the European Union had just 12 members, and the closest Europe came to a common currency was not the euro, but the ECU. Today, there are 28 member states, of which 18 are within the Eurozone. European integration is sometimes seen as being part of the process of globalization. Through the single market, it intensifies the mobility of capital and undermines the national tax bases that are required to finance welfare states. Conversely, the European Union is also seen as a bulwark against globalization, seeking ways to adapt the European social model to the realities of the modern world. Since 1994, these realities have included the rise of the Chinese economy, the release of cheap money around the world, a series of asset price booms followed by the credit crunch, global financial crisis, several sovereign debt crises, the Eurozone crisis, and fiscal austerity. Yet the impact of these huge worldwide economic shocks has not been uniform. We know that mortgage markets remain distinct. Some housing markets are prone to endemic boom-bust cycles. Others remain strikingly stable. The Netherlands and Germany have well-integrated economies. They share a currency and have similar standards of living. Yet one has the largest social rented sector in the Western world. The others is amongst the smallest. Policy choices remain possible. The headline theme of the conference is Beyond Globalization. It is followed by a challenge to join in remaking housing policy in a complex world. If we accept that policy choices remain possible, we need to address the questions that follow. Where should decisions be made? How should different jurisdictions relate to one another? When should sovereignty be retained, claimed, or reclaimed? When should it be shared? And what kind of policy instruments should we use? Can a greater use of regulation be a substitute for public expenditure? Can rights be an effective means to empower the vulnerable and powerless? Or are they a legalistic distinction from the real business of allocating scarce material resources on a fair and efficient basis? These are debates that are taking place across the world, and they are related to the themes of our plenary sessions covering people, place, money, and home. In Scotland, we are having our own particular debate. In September, we vote on whether Scotland should become an independent country. This is a fiercely debated issue, but it is less about identity and more about shaping society than might be expected. Participants on both sides of the debate make clear their identity. No one doubts that Scotland is a nation. The question is whether it should become a sovereign state. There is even agreement between many people on both sides about the kind of society that they would like to live in. The dispute centres on the means to achieve it. How do we remake policy in a complex world? The last time the ENHR conference was held in Scotland, all strategic decisions relating to the country were made by the UK government and Westminster Parliament, even though many policies were administered by a separate Scottish office. In 1999, following a referendum, the Scottish Parliament, which was suspended in 1707, was reconvened, and important areas of legislative competence were transferred from London to Edinburgh. These included housing, but not housing benefit, the housing allowance, which remains an important element in a Great Britain-wide social security system and represents the largest financial subsidy to housing. And of course, responsibility for economic management remains with the UK government. In the traditions of ENHR, the first plenary session is devoted to housing in the host nation. Shortly, my colleagues will provide an overview of housing in Scotland, highlighting some of its distinctive features alongside some of the challenges we face. Before then, it is with great pleasure that I invite the Deputy First Minister of Scotland to give the opening address to this conference. Nicola Sturgeon is the member of the Scottish Parliament for the south side of Glasgow. Before being elected to the Scottish Parliament in 1999, she worked in a law centre in Drumchapel, which serves the residents of one of Glasgow's large public housing estates. In addition to her post of Deputy First Minister, Nicola is Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure, Investment and Cities, which gives her ultimate responsibility for housing. Please welcome Nicola Sturgeon.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark, for so ably and I think so eloquently setting the scene for what I'm sure are going to be extremely interesting and thought-provoking discussions over the course of the day. I'm absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to join you at the start of what is a very ambitious and a very exciting gathering of experts from across the world. Let me start by giving a very, very warm welcome to Scotland to those of you who are here from other countries. I understand around 25 countries represented at this conference. The weather is always as it is today in Scotland, I can assure you, so please feel free to come back for your holidays in years to come. 20 years have passed since this conference last convened here in Scotland, and I think it's fair to say you really couldn't have picked a better year to come back here to meet again in Scotland. 3 weeks today, we will stage the opening ceremony of the 2014 Commonwealth Games in my home city of Glasgow. We're also in the midst of our second year of homecoming. For those of you who don't know, the year of homecoming is an opportunity for us in Scotland to encourage everybody around the world with links, real or imagined, to Scotland to pay us a visit, to come home for a period. We've had, or we will have, 800 different homecoming events taking place throughout the country this year. So if anybody here from outside Scotland wants to claim a link to Scotland, I'm sure we'll manage to designate this conference as one of our official homecoming events. And then in September, we will have a small event that Mark referred to, which I'll say a word or two about later on. But the bigger event we'll celebrate in September is the Ryder Cup, when we'll get the opportunity to celebrate Scotland's place as the home of golf and demonstrate that we are the perfect stage for world-class events. So I think it's fair to say you're meeting here in Edinburgh in the midst of one of the most exciting years in Scottish history, and you are very, very welcome. I hope you enjoy everything that Scottish hospitality has to offer you. The only word of advice I would give you is enjoy some of that hospitality in moderation, because it can have ill effects if you do otherwise. Let me also congratulate those who have organised this conference, especially the local organising committee. I understand this is one of the biggest years yet for this gathering, and I want to thank Heriot-Watt University for chairing the conference and for giving me the opportunity to be here. The four main themes of the conference, place, people, money and home, are as central to housing policy debates in Scotland as they are to these debates in any other country in the world. I like to think that the Scottish Government has a strong track record of working closely with academia, including the 5 universities hosting this conference, to design our policies and to ensure that we understand their impact. It was that determination to focus on evidence that led us in Scotland to introduce our National Performance Framework back in 2007. For those of you not familiar with that, the framework provides a unified vision of the kind of country we want Scotland to be, and it then ensures that we can judge our actions against that framework and ensure that we are implementing actions that will improve the quality of life for people in Scotland. In short, it means that all of our public services, government, local authorities, our National Health Service, all parts of the public sector are working together towards shared goals. And we define these shared goals in terms of the benefits they bring to citizens, not just the benefits in terms of the efficient delivery of services. And critically, that framework provides a structure for measuring and reporting on our progress towards achieving the outcomes and the vision of the kind of country we want to be. And there is no doubt whatsoever that housing is central to achieving our vision of the kind of country we want to be and central to achieving our ambitions for Scotland. It's a vital component of our drive to secure economic growth and social justice and to tackle inequality. Evidence, and I know I don't need to convince this audience of this point, evidence shows that good quality housing and good quality housing services promote better life chances and transform lives. They make an enormous contribution to the well-being of our communities. They lead to increased educational attainment, improved health for young and old alike, and a better environment for people to live in and to grow up in. So it's absolutely vital that our housing policies are based on robust analysis and robust evidence. The world-renowned research units that we have here in Scotland and that are represented here are a great asset in helping us design better policies, and I want to put on record my thanks and appreciation to them for all that they do. In short, our vision in Scotland is for a country where everybody can live in high-quality, affordable and sustainable homes within healthy and thriving communities. That's our vision, aim and objective. And while we have work to do to attain and achieve that objective, the policies that we are pursuing and implementing do have us, I believe, on the right path towards that. So this morning I want to talk to you about how we are aiming to achieve that through our distinctly Scottish approach. And in doing so, I want to focus on a couple of key issues. Firstly, our approach to working closely with the communities we house and support. And secondly, about the value we place on investing our resources now to build a better future for Scotland. And thirdly and finally, I'll reflect briefly on the referendum that Mark mentioned in his opening remarks. Scotland's people, in our view, are our greatest asset, and they're best placed to make and shape decisions about things that affect them. And it's that principle we seek to reflect in all of our policy making and in all of our decision making. That belief of the power of people, the power of communities, is at the heart of our focus on local self-determination, shaped through a strong Scottish Parliament, strong local authorities and strong communities. And our approach to housing and planning focuses very much on the importance of decisions being made and driven locally. Local housing strategies ensure that housing need and housing demand are addressed locally and then inform investment decisions. Local self-determination is also the key principle underpinning the Community Empowerment Bill, a piece of legislation currently going through the Scottish Parliament. The driving force behind that legislation is the view that we will unlock more of Scotland's potential through community empowerment. Scotland is fortunate in being a wealthy nation. We're one of the wealthiest nations in the world, but too many of our people, too many of our communities are trapped in poverty and unable as a result of that to release their true potential. But we know that communities can achieve great things when given the tools, the information and the opportunity and resources to achieve their own goals. So it's essential that we recognise the talents that exist in our communities and support people to achieve the outcomes that are important to them. Our regeneration strategy sets this out and recognises that regeneration needs to be tackled in a holistic way, addressing the physical, the economic and the social needs that exist in our communities. At the field trips yesterday in New Lanark, Dundee, North Glasgow and along the canal in Edinburgh, I hope you will have witnessed some examples of both existing and evolving regeneration initiatives. We believe that the changes required will only be achieved in a sustainable way when communities themselves play a part in delivering change. That's why we focus funding on what we call community anchor organisations, including registered social landlords, community development trusts, to help them support their communities, drawing on the strengths of local people. It's why we recently launched a test programme called Strengthening Communities to further support and assist community organisations in the work that they do. The regeneration of Glasgow's East End shows us some fantastic examples of what can be achieved when communities are supported to develop their own assets. For example, the new plan to develop a community hub in the East End of Glasgow. That hub is developed by and with and for local people. It will provide a community hall, local employment services, amenities and educational facilities. Evidence, of course, shows that major sporting events can speed up and extend regeneration plans, and that hub is in the heart of the part of Glasgow that will host the Commonwealth Games in just a few weeks' time. Interestingly, the Athletes' Village for the Commonwealth Games that will, over the days to come, be housing athletes from across the world will, after the Games have finished, be adapted to provide 700 homes for people to live in, 400 of which will be for social rent, demonstrating a long-lasting legacy of a short and hopefully very successful sporting occasion. As part of empowering communities, we have also developed the Scottish Housing Charter, which challenges all landlords to match the performance of the best. The Charter itself was developed with tenant and landlord groups to ensure that its standards reflect what matters most to tenants, provides a clear statement of what landlords should be delivering and gives landlords a clear idea of what they should be focusing on. Also provides information about how well landlords are performing so that tenants can hold them to account and ensure that public investment in new social housing goes to landlords that are shown to be achieving good outcomes for tenants. Turning to my second point, as I'm sure you're all aware, Scotland can boast a fantastic history of achievement and innovation stretching back through the generations. But we know as a country that we need to look forward. We need to invest effort and resources now to ensure that we are building a better future for our country. We have ambitious policies in Scotland to prevent homelessness, to improve the availability and quality of our social housing, to combat fuel poverty and reduce carbon emissions. Evidence tells us that investing resources in these areas now will both improve lives and help reduce the impact of climate change in the future. In 2003, the Scottish Parliament passed legislation which, at that time, certainly was unprecedented across Europe, that from the end of 2012, all unintentionally homeless households would be entitled to settled accommodation. That has now been achieved, a fact of which we are very proud of in Scotland, proud that our counterparts in Europe regard Scotland as leading the way in its progressive homelessness legislation and in our approach to addressing and tackling homelessness. But what is very clear to us is that we need to continue to focus on preventing homelessness before it occurs. To help meet the homelessness commitment, the government funds 5 regional housing options hubs across the country. These bring local authorities and their partners together to develop homelessness prevention approaches and share best practice. They've resulted in some quite radical changes in the way local authority and other services are delivered. They've created a shift of culture and attitude that allows us to prevent homelessness by considering how we can address the needs of individual households rather than just seeing them as an application that somebody's got to process. And that approach has contributed to a significant fall in recorded homelessness in recent years, a 40% fall in homeless applications between 2006 and 2013. And more importantly, it's leading to better outcomes for homeless people. And that can only be a good thing for our future. A further important step we've taken in preventing homelessness is to introduce a new housing support duty, putting a requirement on local authorities to ensure that households receive the support they need, from budgeting to coping with isolation, support that will help them sustain tenancies and help to stop homelessness reoccurring. That kind of housing support is critical in sustaining tenancies, particularly for some of our most vulnerable groups. We all want people in Scotland to be able to live in good quality, warm, comfortable homes. We want to improve the condition and energy efficiency of the homes that people live in. Homes can only become more energy efficient if they're in a good state of repair. So our sustainable housing strategy sets out the actions we're taking to deliver a step change in the provision of energy efficient homes. Fuel poverty, as we know, continues to affect families across the country. Our fuel poverty target is necessarily very challenging. Our target is to ensure that by November 2016, so far as is reasonably practicable, no one in Scotland is living in fuel poverty. Between 2013 and 2016, we'll have spent nearly £250 million delivering measures that are designed to improve domestic energy efficiency, reduce fuel costs and tackle fuel poverty. Another key part, absolutely fundamental part of our aim to create a fairer society is our commitment to preserving and expanding our social housing stock. We make no apology in Scotland. On the contrary, we are proud of our continued ongoing commitment to a thriving social rented housing sector, and much of our policy is designed to ensure that we can deliver that commitment in practice, not just now, but for years to come. That's why just last week, legislation in the Scottish Parliament abolished the right to buy social housing, not because we don't want to encourage home ownership. We've got many schemes in Scotland that encourage people and support people into home ownership, but because we believe if we're investing in social housing, then we also have a duty to protect that social housing for the future so that it is there to serve the needs of those who rely on that type of housing. We've also put in place substantial funding for new affordable housing. Mark spoke earlier on about the financial constraints we live in, have lived in for the past few years and continue to live in. But within that, in Scotland, we've taken steps to maximise the investment that we are able to make in affordable housing. We set ourselves a target back at the start of this session of the Scottish Parliament to deliver 30,000 new affordable homes by March 2016. We are, as of now, well on track to meet that commitment with almost 20,000 affordable homes already delivered. And it's important to stress that of that 30,000 target, 30,000 affordable homes, 2/3 of these will be for social rent. So we're putting into practice that commitment to ensuring the continuation of a healthy, thriving social rented sector. So I hope I've been able to give you a sense of the approach we are taking in Scotland to building new homes that provide quality, affordable accommodation for people to live in, but the steps we are taking to ensure that we are doing that within communities that are healthy and thriving and provide the best environment for people to live in and to grow up in. I want, before I finish, just to touch on the other events of this year, not the Commonwealth Games or the Ryder Cup or Homecoming, but the independence referendum that Mark spoke about. Mark talked about participants on both sides of the debate. I suppose I should declare my interest. I'm a participant on one side of the debate. I I'm campaigning for a yes vote in the referendum. And I want to just briefly say why, in relation, with reference to the debates you will have today, why I believe it's important. 15 years ago, yesterday, our Scottish Parliament was officially opened for the first time by Her Majesty the Queen. In these 15 years, I think we've demonstrated in Scotland the power of being able to take decisions that affect and shape the future of our country here in Scotland. And perhaps nowhere have we better demonstrated that than in the field of housing. Because much of what I've been talking about in terms of the policies around housing and communities that we pursue in Scotland are only possible because we've got the ability in our own Parliament to pursue these policies. But we nevertheless operate within constraints. We can decide how many houses we want to build and where we want to build them, but we're constrained in the funding we can apply to that because we don't have power to borrow money in the markets. We can decide that we want to have a social rented housing sector and we want it to thrive, but we cannot influence decisions around housing benefit and the wider welfare system. So the case for independence, as Mark rightly says, is not about identity. It's about, and this goes to one of the themes he spoke about, it's about where decisions are best taken. I believe decisions about Scotland are best taken in Scotland. Scotland as a country has always been outward-looking, and we always will be outward-looking. We'll play our part in the world across the British Isles in an atmosphere of friendliness and wanting to work together. But the ability to take the decisions that shape our country here is the fundamental argument for Scotland becoming an independent country. So I want to end by thanking you again for giving me the opportunity to be here today. I've got no doubt that Scotland has got a great deal to teach other countries in terms of the approach we take to the decisions, to the issues that you'll be debating here today. But equally, I've got no doubt that we have much to learn from the approaches and the experience that you bring here from other parts of the world, and we'll be delighted to share those experiences and learn from you over the course of your discussions. I wish you well with the rest of your conference. Have a fantastic time, and I hope you get to enjoy all that Edinburgh has to offer. Thank you very much indeed.
Nicola, thank you so much for your opening address. As researchers, we aspire to provide research that is generally useful in informing housing policy. And it is reassuring in your address to learn the importance that you and the Scottish Government attach to housing, and also recognise the value that research can play in forming housing policy. I'm now going to hand over to Alan Ferguson, Director of the Chartered Institute of Housing in Scotland, to introduce the next part of this session on housing policy in Scotland.
Morning, colleagues, and welcome to the first plenary housing policy in Scotland. As Mark said, my name is Alan Ferguson. I am Director of the Chartered Institute of Housing, and I'm going to be chairing this session. I'm not going to go through all the bio details as you have them in your packs, but I'm pleased to say that we have Keith Contray, University of Glasgow, Raymond Young, CBE, Suzanne Fitzpatrick, Heriot Watt University, and Douglas Robertson, University of Stirling. As has already been said, this is a major year in the life of Scotland. We are in the throes of determining whether we want to stay within the UK or whether we want to be an independent country, determining what kind of Scotland we want to be, what kind of Scotland we want to live in, and how any changes in the institutions of government might affect the daily lives of those living in Scotland. The debate about constitutional change is not an end in itself, but is something that presents us with the opportunity to think, explore, engage and decide. And make no mistake, irrespective of the outcome, Scotland faces real challenges about how to make a different, a better Scotland. A better Scotland which deals with the significant income gap between the rich and the poor, which tackles the health differences between rich and poor areas and between Scotland and the rest of Europe, particularly the gap in life expectancy, which eradicates the scourge of fuel poverty, which regenerates those neighbourhoods still suffering from multiple deprivation, which ensures a skilled population with access to jobs, which provides housing to those desperately in need of a home they can call their own, which improves existing housing, driving up standards, improving energy efficiency, and contributing towards meeting Scotland's climate change targets, which provides opportunities for people to make positive change at the local level. That's why the themes of this conference, people, place, money and home, are so relevant. No one can deny the importance of a home for us all. It's where we feel warm, safe and secure. But the place that home is situated, the location of that home, is essential as well. People want a home in an area they like, that meets their needs, that provides the services they want, and they're proud to bring friends and relatives to. But of course, money is crucial. Whether for individuals and to ensure a decent income for households, or the public, private, the level which provides good quality housing in decent areas, contributing to the home that people strive for. This session will touch on the themes by looking at overall aspects of housing policy, by focusing on two aspects of policy and practice that differentiates us from the rest of the UK and elsewhere, and at what we need to think about and what we might achieve, how we might achieve a better future. Could you please welcome our first speaker, Keith Kintrae, University of Glasgow.
Okay, Alan, thank you very much indeed. Line up with four of us to talk about housing policy in Scotland. My job, and it's necessarily a partial take, is to talk about the development of housing in Scotland in 12 minutes or so. Now, as you may have appreciated from the Minister's talk, housing in Scotland has always stood out somewhat from other parts of the UK. And perhaps since devolution, it has become slightly more distinctive, which I will get onto. Scotland, I think, was always a land historically of housing extremes and low real wages historically, the ability of multiple interests to take profit in land, a flattered tradition in cities and towns, led to some extremely poor housing conditions, whether that was in the cities or in the industrialised countryside, in the mining communities, or whether that was in the clearance townships of the north. And the impacts on people's lives through overcrowding and intolerable conditions really till quite late in the 20th century was extremely severe. And then when the response came to those severe circumstances, the response was also quite severe or extreme. And Scotland took to the state with great enthusiasm as a replacement for the market, to replace the market which had believed to have caused so much misery. So this is not one of our mountain or purple heather-clad mountain ranges in profile. It is the house building record of Scotland through the 20th century. And you can see that public sector supply really dominated Scotland in a way that it didn't do in other parts of the UK. So by the 70s, more than half of housing in Scotland was owned and managed by public authorities. Glasgow's enthusiasm, and I'm, of course, speaking, as it were, from Glasgow, Glasgow's enthusiasm for slum clearance and replacement with mass housing forms is quite legendary. But really, through wherever you go in Scotland, you see townscapes that are dominated by housing that was built by the public sector through the 20th century, for example, here in Aberdeen. Now, as has already been mentioned, the last time ENHR was in Scotland was 20 years ago. This is a conference bag from my attic. It's quite a rare item these days, and I will be putting it up for auction on eBay after the conference. Strangely, it doesn't tell us that it was in Glasgow or the year, but let me assure you this is the genuine item, or at least a photograph of it. Now, in '94, I think, the housing system at that time was already undergoing a pretty fast change under the influence of the governments of Margaret Thatcher and then John Major. And the deregulation of the private rented sector and an increasing reliance, indeed the domination by that time of production of new housing by the private sector. Since 1994, we see a lot less of council housing. We see that falling away. And initially, through the right to buy. Now, if there's one policy of housing that is famous throughout the world from the UK, it is the right to buy. The Minister has told us that it's now been abolished. I think and that's right, or it will be in 2016. But to put that in context, there are about 400,000 households in Scotland who can still have the right to exercise the right to buy. But in the last year, only about 1,000 households did so. So it's become much less important, and certainly it couldn't have been abolished if it was still being, it couldn't have been abolished politically if it was still being exercised with enthusiasm. The reduction in council housing specifically in latter periods, say the last 15 years, has more come through stock transfers to housing associations and to demolition. And that's part of an overall picture of tenure transformation, which this chart from the Scottish Government's own data shows. So home ownership dominates the system. It's about 60% of housing stock. It has moved down a little bit since the global financial crisis, but not much. And we now essentially have a rented sector that has got three parts of more or less equal size. The council sector shrinking, the housing association sector growing slowly, and the private rented sector growing pretty fast. Raymond is going to talk in a minute or two about the very interesting and unique contribution of specifically community-based housing associations in transforming social housing in Scotland and also the communities in which they stand. But latterly, large housing associations, and most controversially, Glasgow Housing Association, have also become important. There's a lot less of this kind of thing in Scotland now. People come to my office, you know, on professional visits, and they're always wanting tours of terrible places for purely scientific reasons, you understand. But actually, most of these kinds of places, which were really significant in Scotland in the 1980s, some really appalling environmental and housing conditions. Really, a lot of these conditions have now gone. At that time, industrial restructuring had impoverished a lot of people. the council sector or the social sector was becoming residualised. The ordinary working families who had been council tenants in the 50s and 60s, their younger counterparts were becoming homeowners, and councils were really ill-equipped to deal with the combination of stock, neighbourhood and social problems. But most of this is now gone. And that's Scotland's last mass-manufactured car there as well, to mark the end of industrialism. Not that particular car, but that model. Okay? And we're also seeing now the kind of end of modernism, almost, the end of modernist solutions in Scotland, most famously here in the Red Road flats in Glasgow, which are still standing, but due to be demolished soon. And we've seen, you know, a lot more of this kind of thing, it has to be said, in Scotland. Improvement, new build, and a lot of that, you know, in regeneration areas, publicly leveraged to stand alongside the housing, of course, that is produced by private developers in flatted forms in cities and in individual housing forms in the suburbs. So a lot of things have changed in Scotland, that's true, but some things have stayed more or less exactly the same. I was a master's student at this university about 30 years ago, okay? One of my first projects that I was called upon to work on as a master's student was to look at the privatisation of a high-rise block in Muirhouse, which is up here in this circle here. And that was one of the poorest areas of Edinburgh at the time. So this is a map of Edinburgh, as you've probably already worked out. The other poor areas at that time, Niddrie, Craigmillar area in the south east of the city, and Westerhare to the west. So this is 2012 Index of Multiple Deprivation, and the map of multiple deprivation is exactly the same. Now, the housing conditions in these areas, the quality of life for people in their communities and their housing, you know, has improved quite a lot. But 30 years of regeneration hasn't significantly shifted the pattern of deprivation. And as perhaps the Minister was suggesting, you know, there are very significant gaps between better off people and poorer people in society. And many of the poorer people live in those council-built estates, no longer council estates. So let me finish by making 4 points about the Scottish Parliament, and this is its magnificent debating chamber here. A key point about the Scottish Parliament is that it has been dominated by broadly social democratic parties, both in opposition and in government, and pro-European parties, by the way, if you want, given some of the antics of our Prime Minister over the last few days. There are no important right-wing parties in Scotland. The Conservative Party, which leads the government in Westminster, has got 15 seats in this chamber out of the 129. So that rather colours the politics of housing in Scotland. And I think the Scottish Parliament, second point, has had a pretty strong focus on housing since the beginning, and partly because of its historical toxic status, as I've tried to explain. And the rights of homeless people, which the Minister referred to and Suzanne is going to tell you more about, are a strong indication of that. I mean, I think some would say, Glenn Bramley pointed out to me yesterday, that perhaps Scotland has had an easier set of issues to deal with than some other parts of the UK, because we have not had the strong demographic change and the very strong housing demand in Scotland. So perhaps that has made things easier in Scotland over the last 15 years than in some other places. And lastly, thank you, Alan, last point. I mean, a lot of Scotland's housing system still resembles that of the rest of the UK, at least, you know, through the main institutions. And significantly in Scotland, as Mark mentioned, financial powers over tax and tax relief and the welfare benefit system are reserve powers in Westminster, and they both significantly shape the system that we have. But of course, that might change come September. So thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Keith. I'm going to move straight on and ask Raymond Young for his presentation.
Thank you. I have 10 minutes to try and do 45 years of quick history. So if this goes past you very quickly, then my apologies in one sense, but not apologies in the other sense. I want to pick up the themes, first of all, of home. Just as a reminder that flats are the traditional Scottish urban format. We are quite European in our approach to urban design. There's a big story to be told why we are, but we're quite different to the rest of the UK. And that, of course, means that tenements are the theme across the board, whether it's in small villages, as I've just shown this one, or like this one in Glasgow. But of course, tenements were not always like this. And in the 1960s, and what I've got is a collection of pictures from the 1960s, this was the urban reality. 1 in 4 Scots shared a toilet, a toilet. We were the worst toileted nation in Europe. I may say that in 1991, when I was in charge of the Scottish House Condition Survey, I was delighted to be able to report to the nation that we were now the best toileted nation in Europe as a result of the work we had done over the years. Because this was the urban vision in the 1960s. This was going to be the kind of country we were going to have based on Le Corbusier. We were going to remove all the slum tenements. Tenements were going to go, we were going to build high-rise, we were going to build motorways, the whole thing. This is part of the Glasgow Ring Road, which was never built. And of course, we were going to get the best architects in the country. This is Basil Spence, so Basil Spence, Coventry Cathedral, etc., build flats. These are now being demolished. We've also dispersal, because we would move people out of the tenements to the peripheral estates. In the meantime, of course, it wasn't just those. It was our whole question of our attitude towards what had been our Victorian heritage. And so buildings like this, a railway station which really competed with St Pancras, was demolished, and then there was a bit of a battle. The middle classes started to campaign to save this kind of thing, but not the working class tenements. However, by the late 60s, there was a feeling within government, a recognition that not all could be replaced, and therefore we had to do something. By January the 14th, 15, 1968, some people say that God got involved and created a great storm which blew roofs off Glasgow, and an emergency program of sorting out roofs, and the whole question of tenement rehabilitation came into play. And the city, Glasgow Corporation, decided that it would make its first attempt at rehabilitation in the old Swan. But having been an organisation that was designed to do clearance and dispersal, it had no idea how to do it in any other way that process. So it wanted to disperse the people from the houses, use its processes, no participation. Okay, that's what the building looks like today, but it's nice. But let's put that to one side and bring the other bit of this. In the 60s, of course, we get this. And those who can quickly read the French will realize it was participe, etc., etc., and il profitant. But this was protest Glasgow style in the late 1960s. This is genuine, this is the public meeting against the closure of a public wash house, where people went to do their washing because they didn't have any facilities. This is it. Now you can see the kind, it's most important that we actually pick up on that as we go through this. At the same time, of course, the government starts to look at issues about people and planning. And the Skeffington report comes in saying we need to change our planning system so that we actually start to involve people. And the place where those two things come together is Govan. where the Deputy First Minister is part of her area. Now, you will see here, of course, Govan has a history. Rent strikes during the First World War, a lot of Labour Party, because Govan was on the river. It's a shipbuilding community, still is, thank goodness. How long, we don't know. And it was a good, lively, working-class area. But behind those facades were poor quality housing, the kind of housing I showed earlier. There were lovely other buildings in the area. There was local culture and traditions. But the whole area was to be comprehensively redeveloped using Skeffington processes. And of course, that meant demolition. 1970s. But still, people had to live in this kind of condition for a development program that was going to take 15 years. There was a local group called the New Governance Society, which was formed to participate in shaping the future. And then a young architecture student, me, comes along and says, what happens to the tenements that have to last for 15 years? What happens to the people that have to live in those 15 years? Can we do something with them? And so we chose an area next to the shipyard, and with excellent play facilities. And yes, that is me to the right. Community-based tenement improvement project. 5 key issues. Commitment, how can we get people involved? What were the technical issues? Because they're quite technically difficult things to fit bathrooms into small flats. Whole question of administration process. Where do we get money? And the ownership issues. Yes, we'll get to community housing associations yet, as you can see. Community development approach was adopted. This lady became the secretary of a traditional residents association, newsletters, leaflets, public, all the stuff we did in the 60s. Community participation, here we are out collecting money. Technical solution was to put bathrooms in a stack into a bed recess, as there was no space in the houses where people could actually used to sleep. And of course, we used the power of the press, the local press, to push a pilot through, and Annie Gibbons, who was the first person, said, I want a bathroom. She wants a bathroom. Right. So we get an application in, press covers it, and in February 1972, we get a show house. 700-odd people visit this bathroom of Mr. and Mrs. J. Gibbons. Use all the techniques that the private sector used to sell their houses now, you know, nice coffee on the go, and all the rest of it. A little bit of marketing. For those who can't read this, it says, life's a drudge with an outside kludge, that's a toilet, but an inside loo's a joy for you. But then we had the ownership issue. We had people who owned the flats, whether they were private landlords or individual non-occupiers, who either couldn't afford or didn't want to improve their flat. So we created a housing association. And that housing association, we decided we'd have something different. Had this been an area which we were all going to be tenants, it would have been a cooperative. But it wasn't a cooperative. We had an area of mixed ownership. And we wanted to keep the mixed ownership. We wanted an opportunity for owner-occupiers who wanted to do that. And so we had an organization that was community organization. And so we invented Central Govan Housing Association as the first community-based housing association. We offered a local office with housing planning, legal and other advice. We did environmental improvements as well. And after years of development, this is what the area now looks like. But the question was, that was a wee pilot project. We got various bits of money together, people rattled cans. How are we going to actually change this? In 1974, the government brings 2 pieces of legislation. One is about tenement rehabilitation, based very largely on the experience we'd had in Govan, and the national one bringing Housing Association grant as a major grant source through an organization called the Housing Corporation. And a partnership between the Housing Corporation and Glasgow City Council led to the mainstreaming of the pilot across the city. Housing associations community-based housing associations became the agent for the council in each of its areas. We decided in a 30-year life rather than the short-term life, we now were looking at tenement rehabilitation as the major activity and of community-based housing associations a major way of delivering them. And over the years, they have transformed, not simply just done rehabilitation, but they've created new areas. This is Govan now, new housing on the left, and other housing associations have developed 21st century tenements. But it's not just in the cities. Community-based housing associations now operate in rural areas as well. And in the mid-1980s, community-based housing association approach was applied to some public sector areas. And this is where Scotland always gets it wrong. It decided that what it had was a silver bullet called the community-based housing associations, and that would solve our problems. So everything suddenly became very much community-based housing associations. And yes, there were some good examples. Perth, an example, very good local, very small community-based housing association running a shop there. And housing associations would take on wider roles. They would look after social, economic, and environmental issues, become almost local community organizations. And the tenure, which we've already seen, Keith has already shown, has changed over the years. But the challenge of that success is something I want to just end up with. And there are 4 issues: scale, scrutiny, control, and the roots that we have. The question of scale becomes very important. We've had this transfers of local authority stock to housing associations. 84,000 houses in the city of Glasgow were transferred to Glasgow Housing Association. Overnight, the largest housing association in Europe. Of course, Glasgow had been the largest municipal local authority owned housing stock in Europe before then. And the plan was to transfer all this stock to local housing associations. So far, we've managed to get something just under 40,000 out of this into local organisations. So there's a long way to go. In the meantime, what we were getting is the housing regulator saying, we now have a major set of organisations, they need to be properly regulated. And the question of the kind of pressures that have been put on organisations mean that we get a lot more business people involved and fewer community-based people. So we get organisations that therefore are saying, to be efficient, we need to be bigger. So we're getting mergers, and we're becoming more. So we're beginning to lose some of the bases. And the questions that remain are, what are the roles for the ordinary resident as a volunteer within these kind of organisations? There's a wonderful drawing. There's a drawing created by the Architects Institute in Scotland to demonstrate that the new community-based housing associations, and these are actual people, I could tell you the names. That's Jean Maguire there, for example. It is not Dame Everidge, but it is Jean Maguire, a local woman, secretary of that housing association, and the architects were calling them the Medicis of Maryhill in recognition of the way that they were being the good clients for the future and producing good quality developments with a lot of public participation. And I've got questions. It's very interesting to hear the Minister talking about the power of people, local self-determination. I just wonder whether we're using words about it, but we're losing the planning and the reality of it. And the question of the future is very important. If you want, and that's a very quick one, and this is my advert, I have a book on it called Annie's Loo, and I'm sure you can get it in Waterson's in Edinburgh, if not on Amazon. Thank you.
Well done. Thanks very much, Raymond. We'll move straight on to Suzanne. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you very much indeed. We were asked in this opening session of the conference to focus on what was different, unique, particular about housing policy in Scotland. And as you'll already have gathered from the Deputy First Minister's speech, the Scottish homelessness legislation is an obvious example to alight upon. And many people in the room will already know something about the Scottish homelessness legislation. But perhaps others of you will not. So I want to say a little bit today about why the Scottish model on homelessness is unique, what's special about it, before saying a little bit more about how it works in practice. The Scottish homelessness legislation is and remains, I believe, internationally unique in offering a legally enforceable entitlement to settled housing for almost all homeless people. This duty falls upon local authorities in Scotland, And what's unique about the Scottish system, and indeed to some extent in the rest of the UK as well, is that if that duty is not met by a local authority, then courts of law will enforce it on their behalf. In most instances, local authorities fulfil the duty by allocating a social housing tenancy to the relevant household. And here what is very relevant is that Scotland retains a large social housing stock. Despite that stock reducing over the last few decades, as other speakers have already outlined, there's still almost a quarter of Scotland's population lives in social housing. So the progressive nature of the Scottish model on homelessness has attracted a lot of international attention in Europe and elsewhere, and indeed a human rights award. But how does it actually work in practice? I think the first thing I want to emphasise is when we talk about homelessness in Scotland and in the Scottish model, we are talking about a very broad definition of homelessness. What we're not talking about is, or at least we're not only talking about, is rough sleeping and people who are literally roofless. In Scotland, and indeed elsewhere in the UK, you are statutorily homeless if you don't have accommodation which is reasonable for you and your family to live in. In fact, very few people accepted as homeless in Scotland are literally on the streets or sleeping rough, something like 2 or 3%. The overwhelming majority of people accepted as homeless in Scotland have some form of accommodation, but they are about to be evicted or they've been asked to leave that accommodation, or for some reason it's not reasonable for them to remain living where they are. Sometimes because of the physical conditions, but more often actually because of the social conditions, because there's a threat of violence or relationships have broken down. So bear in mind when we talk about the Scottish model and homelessness, we're talking about that broad definition of homelessness. We're not just talking about people sleeping rough. Which homeless people does it help? I think one of the points of context that's worth making on the Scottish model on homelessness is it didn't suddenly emerge out of nowhere. It didn't suddenly appear after devolution in 1999. It builds on a model that's been in place across Great Britain since 1977, whereby local authorities have been obliged for all of that time, for almost 40 years in fact, to secure long-term accommodation for priority need groups of homeless households. Those priority need groups being primarily families with children, but also vulnerable adults. What's different about Scotland is rather specific. What's different about Scotland is that we have now abolished that requirement for a homeless household to not only be homeless, but also to be in priority need in order to be entitled to rehousing. Elsewhere in the UK, you still have to be in a priority need group. In Scotland, virtually all homeless people are entitled to rehousing. And the main group that makes a difference to is single people, because in England and elsewhere in the UK, they would not generally be accepted as statutorily homeless, but in Scotland, the majority of those accepted as homeless are single people, most of them, in fact, single men. So that's the main group that's benefited from this radical widening of the homelessness safety net in recent years in Scotland. And it is worth stressing that the sort of scale of the impact of the homelessness legislation in Scotland is a very large number of people benefit from it on an annual basis. In the last financial year, 30,000 households were accepted as statutory homeless in Scotland. 67% of them were single people, 2/3 of whom were single men. How did it come about? Well, with devolution in 1999, you had a young, eager Scottish Parliament dominated by centre-left parties, as Keith has already highlighted. It continues to be dominated by social democratic parties. And you also had a very professionalised, well-organised homelessness sector in Scotland of voluntary groups, of pressure groups, who were very well integrated into the Scottish political process and debate. So homelessness, if you like, presented itself as an ideal topic for progressive reform, for a parliament that wanted to make its mark on a flagship social justice issue. I suppose one thing that I sometimes think is worth stressing about this is the progressive nature of the Scottish homelessness legislation doesn't mean it was a grassroots movement like the one Raymond was talking about in terms of community-based housing associations. This was in fact very much a top-down initiative driven by progressively minded politicians, civil servants, voluntary sector organisations, the political elites, in other words, rather than being something that came up from a grassroots movement, which I think is interesting in itself. While it was Labour ministers that chaired the cross-sectoral homelessness task group, which developed a legislation passed in 2003 that introduced the Scottish model, in other words, abolished priority need, it has enjoyed very broad political support ever since, including from the current SNP administration. In fact, I think one of the most remarkable things about the Scottish homelessness model is the degree of consensus that it still appears to command within Scotland, and has been sustained over the 10-year period of implementation through to its conclusion in December 2012, when the priority need criterion, which had been gradually expanded over the past decade, was finally abolished. But I suppose the most important thing is it effective? We might have this model, it might be internationally unique, it might command broad support, but does it actually work for homeless people? In short, yes, it does. Homeless people are in practice rehoused. As I said, 30,000 households were accepted in the last financial year. And these homeless people do have a very strong priority in allocation of social housing. By and large, local authorities fulfil their duties, and there are actually rather few legal challenges, or at least there have been in recent years. But the problem is that many homeless people do spend quite extended periods in temporary accommodation awaiting the allocation of permanent and settled housing. The use of such temporary accommodation almost trebled in the decade from 2001 to 2011. Now, this temporary accommodation is generally provided in ordinary mainstream social housing often, rather than in institutional settings. So people are generally not in hostels and shelters and so on. But nonetheless, being somewhere which is temporary for an extended period is obviously distressing for the households involved and also expensive to the public purse. The reason why people are spending a long time in temporary accommodation in certain parts of Scotland is mainly because of the shortage that we now face in permanent accommodation in some parts of the country. I was a member of the Homelessness Task Force that developed the Scottish model, and when we were developing that in the early 2000s, I think we thought that the real pressure on social housing would probably be limited to Edinburgh and other parts of the east of Scotland, perhaps some rural areas, and West Central Scotland would cope quite well with this expansion of priority need and this widening of the safety net for more homeless people. In fact, for a whole range of reasons, some of which have already been touched on this morning, pressure on social housing is much greater across most of the country than we expected, which means that until quite recently, we were getting to the point where almost half of all new social housing lets were going to statutory homeless households, leading to concerns about crowding out other groups who are in housing need. So there's been a move, as the Minister mentioned, towards a housing options model just recently, since about 2010, with more emphasis on local authorities looking at the whole range of ways in which a household's housing crisis can be resolved, rather than just looking at their entitlements under the homelessness legislation. To my mind, this is a good thing. The homelessness legislation should be a safety net. It shouldn't be the default route into, or the majority route into social housing. But there is an ongoing debate, which I remain part of, about how you balance ensuring that people have their rights met with this more flexible, open, more informal approach to resolving housing crisis. And that's not something we've quite sorted out in Scotland as yet. The other major challenge that we face at the moment, which I'm sure you'll hear more about from UK presenters over the next few days, is welfare reform, or rather welfare cutbacks, as some would have it. Welfare reform is a very large, very complicated topic for us at the moment, but the key point for me in terms of this presentation is that reforms to our housing benefit system, that's the UK housing allowance system, mean that an increasing number of both private and social tenants are finding it difficult to pay for their rent from that allowance. That makes homelessness more likely and also makes it more difficult to rehouse people who are already homeless. So we face major challenges. There's other challenges to the Scottish model on homelessness, but I think the pressure on permanent housing and welfare reform are really the two key issues which concern us at the moment. So to conclude, a fortuitous set of circumstances allowed the Scottish model to develop. There was the political will. You had this centre-left Scottish Parliament and administration looking for a flagship social justice policy. You had a small, cohesive and like-minded group of key actors able to push that through, to be honest, without the public noticing, really. This was not something that was part of mainstream public debate. It was something that was driven from the top. The model is far from perfect. It faces a number of severe challenges at the moment. But what it does mean, and I think this is very important, is that the poorest and most marginalised people cannot be excluded from social housing in this country, and local authorities have an ongoing responsibility to meet the housing needs of some of the most vulnerable people in the community, particularly groups like single men with complex needs who might otherwise be turned away with little or no help. And in one of the plenary sessions later today, Beth Watts, in the People plenary session, Beth Watts will be outlining her findings on the difference that rights framework makes to the experience of men in Scotland as compared with single homeless men in Ireland, where there is no such rights framework. So, in my view at least, there is much to be proud of in what Scotland's achieved on homelessness rights, and I hope some of you go along to hear a bit more about that from Beth this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. And last but not least, Douglas Robertson. Thanks, Douglas.
Very much. Just. Which one do I press? Academics and technology. Oh yes, that's me. I thought I'd put this up because we've had a lot of talk about the politics, and when you arrived, or some of you arrived on Monday, this was the main story. For those of you that don't know, haggis is a meat product which is banned in America, but this is the high point of our campaign between the Scottish and the Westminster Parliament. We are, as you say, having this political debate, so I thought I would put up a racist anti-Scottish poster, and I would put up some happy pigs. And we're in this situation of having to decide, oh, aye, maybe, no, and you can get a passport in September. So I would leave it at that if you want to get these products that are available all over Edinburgh. So in terms of this event, we were asked to look at beyond globalisation, the remaking of housing policy, and the focus, and I'm sorry, this is me just going back to the organising committee and because I lost some debate. We wanted to look at money, and money is quite true, economics, sociology, but you guys in here that do the money bit, you're the Premier League. You are the premier position within the field that is the study of housing. We've got place, we get regeneration, economics, sociology, geography, psychology. You're second tier. You get people, rights, legal studies, sociology, a wee bit of political science, third tier. You get home, which is emerging, but because it's domestic, gendered, sociological, and psychological, you're fourth tier. The ones that we missed out, of course, are land, largely because Glenn Bramley didn't argue hard enough. And the other one is power, I think, which is inherently there. Land, just quickly, because we're just 10 years out of a feudal system of land ownership, I think it still is a major concern within the Scottish context to look at the future. And in terms of power, the power in housing, I think, has been quite intriguing. I remember Tony O'Sullivan, some of you will remember Tony, happily retired now from housing academic work. And when I was a student with him at Glasgow, I said, you know, what's this thing about, you know, housing? He said, oh, it's quite simple. It's quite simple. The rich get good housing, the poor get crap. And that's it. He said, what's the problem? And in a sense, that economic perspective is true, but at the same time, the reason that most of us are here is we probably want to try and do something about that. What we notice is that, and one of the commitments of the conference was to try and say, break down these silos. If we come up with these headings, we'll try and merge people together and get something different out of it. And then, unfortunately, you look at the workshop sessions, and all the silos have wonderfully repositioned themselves. And again, you can look at the number of papers in different areas, and you can see, I think, my hierarchy of issues within a housing conference. This still obviously happens within futures, and then in terms of what we're looking at, these are some of the futures that Raymond and others and Keith were talking about. This is the Clyde Valley Plan, the Edinburgh Plan, the Tay Valley Plan. We used to plan in big areas around water courses. The other one that's missing there is the Darling Plan for the West Highlands. And it's one of the interesting things in the Scottish debate. You've had a very urban focus. The one thing that has actually been quite successful in Scotland, again, nobody seems to notice this, is that the Highlands was a poverty neighbourhood beyond belief. It's not that problem to the same degree, and largely because of a community-based approach to economic regeneration that was all tied in. And the gist of what I'm arguing, in a sense, is for futures, we have to move away from the idea of these top-down approaches, and we actually have to try and engage and do this cross-discipline stuff, which we all talk about, but when it comes down to it, nobody's really that keen on. We've seen the regeneration and renewal. This is Glasgow 1950s. Interesting photograph. This, as Raymond showed you earlier, this was the Bruce Plan. This was Glasgow Council's plan. And a lot of people are critical of this, but actually the council did achieve quite a lot of this programme. Oh, sorry, I'll go back. You can see that they, with these master plans and all these connections and all the interconnections and all the work, we ended up with housing. We didn't get any, this is 1950s, we didn't get any environmental money. That got cut, so that everybody's putting up their wooden fences. So nothing much has changed there. And then you saw the original sketch. This was the one. These flats were, believe it or not, to be blown up with the Commonwealth Games. So the opening of the Commonwealth Games, all of these flats were to be blown up as a celebration of what? So the solutions, the top-down solutions, haven't always worked. And when the bubble burst, and it did burst, it was a bit of a nightmare. And the nightmare comes through. This is the Gorbals. This area has been regenerated 5 times now, I'm sure. 4, 3, 4, well, who knows. But you get your 1930s clearance, you get your high-rise, you've got your old Victorian, you've got your 1980s. But the environment, as you can see, despite the bronze cones, which I understand from a second-hand market, if you take a van and hit them, you can take them to the scrappy and get quite a lot of money very quickly. So, in terms of looking to the future and trying to tie some of these elements together, we've had a lot, in a sense, around the issue of money. And I come back, some of you will be talking about money, and there was links made to money throughout. The reason I've put this is to my homage to Raymond Young, because I remember in some intense and difficult arguments about the introduction of private finance and the distribution of resources, Raymond said to me, well, spreading resources around housing in Scotland is just like jam. Some bits get more because there are lumpy bits that need a bit more. This is how finance works. So I hope the people working today on finance adopt this model. We used to be very good in Scotland, and in looking at the future, one of the things we were very excellent at was having a fantastic municipal finance system. We developed municipal finance, people borrowing, people saving, linking it all together. We had a whole insurance system. Unfortunately, then the big bang came in 1996, and all our municipal enterprises, all our great work of careful bankers disappeared, and we ended up with the Royal Bank of Scotland. And I'm sorry, it's a sad thing to say, but it was the biggest corporate financial disaster of any business in this country. It was bailed out by the government to the tune of £50 billion. Yes, £50 billion. So there is money if the money is needed. And also, I have to say, and it's a difficult thing because it's a state-owned bank, this year's bonus pot for the Royal Bank of Scotland, which made a financial loss, was £2.5 billion. So there is money in different places, and we have not been particularly good at that. The failures that we see in terms of home ownership and public renting to produce sustainable and quality environments merely act, as we see every day in the media, to reproduce, enhance, and now exaggerate the financial health and educational and cultural inequalities which are evident throughout society. Housing used to solve problems. Now housing is actually one of the core contributors to these problems. Keith talked about place, and again, this is the classic Glaswegian approach to some of the statues. In Edinburgh, you don't get such adornments. But place is challenging. Keith's own thesis, he talked about the fact that not much had changed in terms of the poor neighbourhoods, and there is a Groundhog Day impact in terms of regeneration in Scotland. The problem is that place is highly classed. It is highly stigmatised, and despite the never-ending approaches and spending lots of money, the class and stigma does not necessarily move. Placemaking in Scotland in the future is also hampered by, unfortunately, I oppose what the Minister said, we do not have strong local government. We have exceptionally weak local government, which only raises 14% of its income from local taxes and is therefore very much controlled by national government. So the importance of place, identity, belonging and attachment needs to be taken forward in terms of issues around well-being and home. People, and this is an odd thing, cycling in Scotland, but in terms of housing policy, people are inextricably linked. And I come back to some of these poverty figures because I think they are important. UNICEF in 2007 for the UK reported, and this is the pre-banking crisis, when account was taken of key measures of well-being, including material well-being, health and safety, peer and family relationships, children in the UK are more disadvantaged than any of the 21 OECD countries. There are now within Scotland 840,000 people in poverty, which for a country of just 5.4 million is quite a lot. The projections in child poverty have just been announced, and I won't go through them. The problem with that is we have a youth justice system in the country and across the world which merely processes and punishes the children of the poor. So if we continue to have poverty at these levels, we will continue to have the crime issues. For example, and back to the homelessness stuff that Suzanne talks about, we have kids in care. A kid is abused in this country. We take them into care. The intervention costs £120,000 per year, and then they end up with the poorest life chances of anybody, poor employment prospects. They find themselves homeless, and then they have a greater chance of being imprisoned and then effectively shut out of society. Being an abused child should not determine your future employment, your housing, your emotional or your well-being journey, but that is the pattern that we have within this country. In terms of home, it's a nice home because that's mine, the failure of common ownership is a big issue in Scotland. We have multiple ownership properties, and you can see that. We have issues around energy efficiency, we have the best policy on energy efficiency, and we also have the best policies around developing well-being. Land, and this photograph was taken by me, land is spectacular because very quickly to finish up, we have half of the land, private land in Scotland is owned by 423 people. That legacy and the changes in land are argued that we might now, and again the Scottish Government has come out with a policy which says that land should be a community resource. how the hell do you do that unless you adopt a Mugabe-esque approach to taking the land back for the people? The land, of course, was stolen from the people because common assets, as a number of you will notice, tend to get taken by rich people, and then eventually we have to try and take them back again. Finally, power. The financial world, I think, is very different. I've covered that. I also think in terms of welfare reform, Steve Bell's cartoon probably captures it better than most academic papers we'll hear about welfare at this conference. In terms of our future, to finish, I think there are issues around the idea of knowledge mobilization. I believe that, as we have heard in terms of the presentations here, we have had an awful lot about top-down, and we've had an awful lot about silos. We needs to attempt to try and do that is to link research, policy, practice, and lived experience. We need to bring all of these pieces of knowledge together, because if we don't do that, we miss out an understanding, and it should not just be the policymakers and the academics that engage. And finally, in terms of a well-being agenda and the development, as the Minister talked about, in relation to outcomes, if you do not have that knowledge mobilization impression, you will not get the society that you're looking for. Yes, we can deliver some of this. I'd rather see a bit more of that. This was what we often thought was quite good. Yes, this is a lot better. This is supposedly good. I'm sorry, I'd have a lot more of that. I hope I've left you with some thoughts and look forward to the conference.
Thanks so much, colleagues. We've run out of time. Just to give you some housekeeping arrangements, because after coffee we're going to go to workshops. There are a number of workshops I need to tell you about. These workshops are taking place in the Crystal Macmillan. So number 4, housing and living conditions of ageing populations. 13, migration, residential mobility and housing policy. Number 15, poverty neighbourhoods. 19, residential environments and people. 20, social housing institutions, organisations and governance. And 24, housing market dynamics. They are all in Crystal Macmillan, and coffee for you will be in Crystal Macmillan. It's now coffee break before the workshops. Can you please thank our presenters for the presentations?